The village of East Byford woke to a Sunday morning of peculiar civility, the sort that suggested careful forethought rather than spontaneous cheer. Even the postman, whose customary scowl was rumoured to rival that of the vicar's sternest sermons, appeared uncharacteristically meticulous, depositing letters with exacting precision beside freshly washed doorsteps. The air carried the faint tang of damp earth and the more insidious scent of self-conscious propriety, as though the dew itself had conspired to highlight the immaculate hedgerows and neatly aligned cobblestones. In the modest convent on Church Lane, Sister Bernardine moved quietly among the pews, her steps a soft metronome to the rhythm of domestic ritual. She adjusted hymnals and polished brass candle holders with an efficiency that disguised the faint agitation behind her calm, for the prior evening had left a small, unsettling weight upon her conscience. The incident in question had occurred just after Compline, when the convent's dimly lit chapel seemed to hold a different atmosphere, more intimate, more susceptible to whispers of confession. A parishioner, known for his exemplary punctuality and habit of over-expressing gratitude at the end of every service, had approached the confessional with unusual hesitation. What followed was brief and outwardly no more remarkable than any other confession, yet the words, carefully measured, lingered in Bernardine's mind long after the penitent had withdrawn, leaving an impression that was at once intangible and insistent. The nun could not identify a single fact to share, and yet a peculiar unease settled, the sort that arises when a secret hovers over the threshold of consciousness without revealing itself fully. By mid-morning, the convent's routine proceeded with the same disciplined decorum that characterized every East Byford institution. Bernardine prepared tea in the parlour, setting cups and saucers with meticulous symmetry, while quietly observing the village from the tall, iron-framed windows. Across the narrow street the parish office opened with a precise adherence to hours, a bell chiming with an insistence that suggested both punctuality and moral rectitude. Miss Whitcomb, the parish secretary, emerged from a small office cubicle, bearing a stack of letters and a frown of such intensity that one might have suspected she was measuring the village's sins against her own. Among the correspondence was an envelope slightly out of place, its paper of a finer texture than the usual stationery, unsealed and bearing no stamp. Bernardine paused, her hand hovering above the cup, as a subtle question arose. Had it been deliberately mislaid, or merely forgotten in a moment of clerical oversight? It was at this precise juncture that Inspector Pewbright arrived, stepping from his modest car with the air of a man whose presence was expected and yet slightly inconvenient. He carried with him the habitual notebook, its leather cover scuffed from frequent consultation, and a pen poised as if ready to capture each nuanced misalignment of village decorum. Pewbright's first observation was the extraordinary regularity of the morning's proceedings, the manner in which every citizen appeared to perform their duties with an almost theatrical polish. He noted the orderly manner in which a group of parishioners entered the post office, each greeting one another with measured cordiality that belied a subtle anxiety, as though each smile had been calibrated to conceal suspicion. "Oh, good morning, Sister Bernardine," he said, his voice measured and deliberate. "I trust the convent finds the morning suitably peaceful." "Good morning, Inspector," she replied, inclining her head. "Peaceful indeed, though there are matters of conscience that occasionally disturb the surface." Her phrasing was careful, designed to hint without disclosing. Pewbright merely nodded, a slight curl of the mouth, suggesting both amusement and appreciation for understatement. The inspector's attention drifted briefly to the misplaced envelope on the parish office desk. He made no immediate comment, allowing the village's natural rhythm to perform the work of revelation in its own time. Conversations proceeded in hushed tones. Mrs. Clavering, chairwoman of the parish fundraising committee, discussed with quiet insistence the merits of a new bell for the church, as though the replacement might atone for broader lapses in communal diligence. Her companion, the vicar's assistant, responded with careful agreement, punctuating each observation with deferential nods that betrayed a hint of fatigue beneath the surface courtesy. Pewbright noted the slight tremor in the assistant's hands when arranging hymnals, a gesture trivial in itself, yet potentially indicative of deeper unease. In the convent parlour, Bernardine poured tea with the methodical grace of long habit. The kettle hissed, the porcelain tinkled gently, and the rhythm of domestic ritual proceeded without apparent disruption. Yet the nun's thoughts returned repeatedly to the previous night's confession, an event that had introduced a fissure beneath the village's meticulously maintained surface. Pewbright, seated across from her, observed without comment, his eyes tracing the subtle tightness in her shoulders, the careful avoidance of eye contact when the discussion touched upon parish matters. He understood that such restraint, far from indicating concealment of trivial details, often marked the very edges of communal tension. The postman delivered a final batch of correspondence. One letter, addressed to a parishioner long accustomed to polite deference, contained nothing overtly scandalous, merely a few sentences concerning subscriptions and committee notices. Yet in Pewbright's experience, letters were often the medium in which village undercurrents revealed themselves, for the absence of direct accusation frequently concealed a far more potent observation. He noted the letter's tone, formally courteous, almost excessively so, and the recipient's immediate adjustment of posture, a silent signal of awareness that something beyond the written words had been implied. By mid-morning, the convent and parish office began to fill with the expected rhythm of visitors, each performing minor errands with exacting politeness. Pewbright watched them, cataloguing the subtle inconsistencies. A parishioner who avoided speaking with another, a shopkeeper whose bow was fractionally delayed, a volunteer whose hands lingered over a ledger in hesitation. The village's civility functioned as both shield and spotlight, exposing cracks not in action, but in intention. Bernardine, conscious of the inspector's presence, felt the confession's residual unease gnawing at her quiet equilibrium. She was aware that although no overt misdeed had occurred, the moral and social tensions now threaded through East Byford like an invisible lattice. Lunch approached with the customary restraint of East Byford citizens. Tea and bread were served with precise moderation, discussions centered on parish events and routine affairs, and yet a faint undertone of unease persisted, like the subtle tremor before an imperceptible shift in wind. Pewbright's gaze lingered on a seemingly innocuous detail. A slight misalignment in the church's notice board, the placement of a committee report marginally askew. In a village of such careful order, even the smallest deviation could signify more than mere inattention. It suggested the unspoken, the deliberately concealed, or the socially inconvenient. Bernardine observed this recognition, her thoughts flickering once more to the previous night's confession, and she wondered whether the secret might pertain to the unseen adjustments of daily life rather than any dramatic act. As the morning waned, Pewbright made his way to the parish records, ostensibly to examine routine entries concerning donations and bell repairs. His approach was indirect, designed to allow the village to reveal itself in its natural gestures. Miss Whitcomb offered her explanations with polite precision, citing clerical oversight and routine delays with a formality that suggested awareness of judgment without overt admission. Pewbright smiled slightly, a gesture almost imperceptible, acknowledging both the civility and the tension. In East Byford, appearances were everything, and the inspector understood that subtle observation often yielded more than direct interrogation. By late morning, Bernardine returned to the chapel, her hands resting briefly on the empty confessional box. The stillness of the room seemed to magnify the unspoken weight of what had been revealed in hushed tones, the residual echo of a confession that had yet to manifest in tangible consequence. Pewbright joined her in quiet reflection, noting that the nun's careful composure masked the faintest tremor of anticipation. The inspector, ever attentive to the understated pressures of village life, allowed the silence to persist, aware that revelation, in East Byford, often arrived not in spectacle, but in observation. A glance, a hesitation, a misaligned document. The chapter drew to a close as a faint sound reached them from the street. The measured steps of a passerby, polite in gait, habitual in rhythm. Bernardine, glancing toward the window, caught the shadow of a figure moving deliberately among the hedges, and a small, silent question formed in her mind. Pewbright noted her look, but said nothing, recognizing the subtle signal as the opening of a thread yet to be unravelled. In East Byford, the weight of a confession need not be borne in dramatic acts. It was enough to disturb the equilibrium, to suggest, with the quiet precision of ink on parchment, that appearances might conceal more than they revealed. And so the morning passed, measured, poised, and pregnant with questions, leaving a hint of unease to trail behind even the most composed of villagers. The parish hall, brightened by late morning sunlight through dust-flecked windows, held an air of deliberate civility, as though the village itself had been instructed to perform the virtues of politeness in measured gestures. Tables were arranged in precise symmetry, each adorned with embroidered cloths and modest china cups, and the scent of baked scones mingled with the faintly antiseptic aroma of over-polished floors. Mrs. Clavering, chairwoman of the parish fundraising committee, presided at the largest table with the studied air of someone who assumed responsibility for both moral oversight and social observation. Her gloved hands rested upon a notebook, which she consulted periodically with a faint sigh, as though the act of supervising civility required subtle exertion. Inspector Pewbright entered quietly, noting the almost imperceptible tension in the room. Villagers, who had arrived in a steady trickle, shifted minutely as he passed, their postures measured to convey both attention and indifference. Each smile seemed pre-calibrated, each nod deliberate, and even the minor fumble of a teacup was managed with meticulous restraint. The inspector, whose observation had long accustomed him to the understated theatrics of small-town conscience, recorded mentally the nuanced social choreography, who deferred to whom, who spoke only when prompted, who lingered in corners as though the walls themselves offered counsel. Bernardine, seated at the side, observed the assembly with a quiet vigilance born of both habit and residual unease. The confession from the previous evening lingered in her mind like a delicate shadow. Its content remained unspecified, yet it had imparted a sense of responsibility, of moral tension, which could not be dispelled by ritual observance alone. She poured herself a cup of tea, noting with dry amusement that even this simple act was performed as if by a public committee, the measured angle of the teapot, the careful alignment of saucer and cup, the faint clink of spoon against porcelain, orchestrated to perfection. Mrs. Clavering addressed the assembly with formal cordiality, speaking of the upcoming bell refurbishment, subscriptions, and the imperative of punctual donations. "We must ensure," she said, voice even and deliberate, "that our efforts reflect both diligence and decorum. The village depends upon our adherence to proper form." Her gaze swept across the room, pausing momentarily on each committee member, whose faces displayed varying degrees of acquiescence and subtle apprehension. Pewbright noted these reactions: the slight tightening of a jaw, the imperceptible tilt of a head, the micro-expression of restrained annoyance. In East Byford, civility frequently masked an undercurrent of rivalry, and rivalry could hide motives one might never hear spoken aloud. A minor incident occurred during the distribution of scones. Miss Prendergast, who had volunteered to pass refreshments, hesitated slightly before offering a plate to the vicar's assistant. The inspector observed a faint shift in the assistant's posture, a quick glance that seemed to acknowledge some unspoken misalignment in village etiquette. Bernardine, noting the exchange, felt a ripple of recognition. Even minor acts executed with apparent carelessness might conceal implications far beyond the table's immediate concerns. Pewbright, taking a small sip of tea, allowed the moment to pass without comment, understanding that in East Byford the most telling observations were often those left unremarked. Conversation proceeded with careful moderation. One parishioner, Mr. Davenhill, inquired politely about the proposed bell schedule, framing his question with excessive regard for precedent and procedural propriety. "I trust the committee has considered both historical timing and current convenience," he said, voice smooth and unobtrusive. The response delivered by Mrs. Clavering was measured but firm. "Indeed, Mr. Davenhill, we have endeavoured to reconcile tradition with practicality, ensuring that neither is unduly compromised." Pewbright observed the slight tremor in Davenhill's fingers as he folded his hands, a subtle indication of underlying dissatisfaction that the words themselves did not reveal. Meanwhile, letters pinned to the parish notice board attracted intermittent attention. A fundraising appeal bore the formal mark of the vicar, yet contained a curious postscript in a different hand, for careful consideration. Pewbright noted this discrepancy, the subtle difference in script hinting at intervention by an unseen hand, an effort to guide perception without overt interference. Bernardine's attention flicked to the postscript as well, recalling the late-night confession and the way certain details, though unspoken, had lingered like shadows along the margins of propriety. During the second round of tea, a minor debate arose over the appropriate method for scone distribution. Mrs. Clavering insisted upon a clockwise rotation, citing custom and efficiency, while Miss Whitcomb suggested an alphabetical arrangement to avoid confusion. The disagreement was conducted with extreme politeness, yet Pewbright noted the tension in the air. Subtle defiance, quiet assertion, the mechanical display of deference mingled with private intent. The inspector, with his customary dry humour, observed that even scones could serve as instruments of social observation, their distribution reflecting status and subtle ambition. Bernardine, noticing a faint tremor in the vicar's assistant's hands once more, reflected on the curious pattern of small inconsistencies that seemed to permeate the village. The confession, although never explicitly named, suggested an underlying disquiet, a moral perturbation that extended beyond individual culpability. Pewbright, quietly cataloguing expressions, gestures and tones, recognized that East Byford civility often functioned as a lattice work, a social structure designed to maintain order while concealing latent resentments. Each polite exchange, each measured nod carried an echo of unspoken anxiety. At one table, the organist offered a quietly humorous anecdote about the previous week's choir practice, delivered with exaggerated modesty. The remark prompted smiles and gentle laughter, but Pewbright detected a subtle tightening among several listeners, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement of some delicate truth. Bernardine noted this with unease, aware that humour in East Byford often served to expose indirectly what could not be spoken directly. The confessional weight, she realized, was not merely a private burden, but a lens through which the social fabric might be scrutinized, revealing concealed rivalries, anxieties, and judgments. The inspector paused as a soft sound reached him from outside the hall, the rustle of a letter sliding beneath a door, an inconspicuous but deliberate act. Pewbright's eyes flicked to Miss Whitcomb, whose hand had lingered over the notice board, and to Mrs. Clavering, whose notebook now displayed a page marginally askew. The incident was minor, almost negligible to anyone untrained in observation, yet it resonated with the quiet precision that defined the village's moral and social economy. Bernardine's gaze followed the movement, registering a faint awareness of the way small gestures might signify intentions not yet revealed. By late morning, the tea concluded, and villagers began to depart, their movements slow, polite, and fraught with subtle signalling. Pewbright noted which hands lingered in farewell, which bows were slightly too formal, which smiles carried the faintest shadow of relief or apprehension. Bernardine, assisting with the clearing of cups and plates, observed the micro-gestures of civility, aware that each carried implications as delicate and consequential as the confession she had received the night before. The inspector's notebook remained closed, yet his mind catalogued every nuance, the precise alignment of napkins, the fractional delay in handing over a teacup, the measured avoidance of direct eye contact. As the hall emptied, a small envelope remained on the side table, unnoticed amid the departing crowd. Bernardine approached it, fingers brushing the paper briefly before she paused, her expression betraying a quiet recognition. Pewbright, standing nearby, inclined his head ever so slightly, allowing her the space to consider the implications without intrusion. In East Byford, revelation rarely arrived in spectacle. It manifested in gesture, timing, and placement. The envelope's presence, subtle and deliberate, suggested the possibility of intention rather than oversight, a question suspended delicately between observation and inference. The chapter closed with a muted sense of anticipation. Bernardine's thoughts lingered on the previous night's confession, now refracted through the morning's interactions, gestures, and minor deviations from perfect propriety. Pewbright, without comment, observed the faint tension in her posture, the careful hesitation in her movements, and the silent acknowledgement of a pattern emerging from what had seemed trivial. In the measured, polite world of East Byford, the first clue of significance had arrived, not through proclamation or drama, but through the quiet, deliberate signalling of human behavior, an almost imperceptible shift that promised questions yet to be explored. The morning sun had barely begun to soften the edges of East Byford when Inspector Pewbright arrived at the parish office, a modest building whose brickwork suggested age rather than grandeur. The office smelled faintly of ink and paper, and the faint hum of a coal stove punctuated the otherwise meticulous quiet. Miss Whitcomb, the parish secretary, sat at her desk with a posture at once prim and attentive, a stack of letters neatly arranged before her as though their precise order could maintain the village's moral equilibrium. She looked up at Pewbright with a measured nod, acknowledging his presence while revealing nothing of her own inner calculations. "Good morning, Inspector," she said, voice perfectly even, as though the timing of greetings could influence ethical outcomes. "We have a few letters of interest, though I hesitate to trouble you with anything that might disrupt routine." Pewbright inclined his head slightly, allowing a faintly ironic smile to betray his appreciation of understatement. "Miss Whitcomb, I trust your judgment. In East Byford, routine often conceals the most revealing details." His tone suggested amusement more than reproach, yet the subtle weight of inquiry lay in every carefully chosen word. The stack of correspondence held little of note until Pewbright's gaze fell upon a single envelope of finer texture than the usual parish stationery, unsealed and with no postmark. Its presence, so small and seemingly insignificant, carried the peculiar weight of interruption. He noted the slight smudge along the flap, as if it had been handled with cautious deliberation, and the faint indentation where a pen had pressed lightly in the upper corner. Bernardine, who had accompanied him, observed the envelope with quiet attention, noting the same subtle clues of intention rather than oversight. Miss Whitcomb cleared her throat delicately. "That one? It arrived yesterday, I believe. It may have been misplaced among the other correspondence, though I cannot say why." Her phrasing suggested the possibility of both error and intentionality, a distinction Pewbright understood to be crucial in small communities. He permitted the silence to settle, allowing the secretary's implication to resonate without further interrogation. In East Byford, indirect revelation often yielded more truth than direct questioning. The inspector opened the envelope with the slow precision of a man accustomed to reading between lines. Inside was a single sheet, typed formally, bearing a message that at first glance appeared innocuous. A routine note concerning committee meetings and minor donations. Yet Pewbright's practiced eye detected a subtle deviation in tone, a phrasing unusually exact, almost insistently formal. One sentence, in particular, hinted at concern over propriety and attendance in a manner too pointed to be ordinary. "We trust that all members will continue to uphold the standards befitting our shared responsibilities." The emphasis, he noted, carried the faintest suggestion of admonishment. Bernardine, glancing at the sheet, felt the familiar stir of unease. She recalled the late-night confession and the persistent sense that what was unspoken carried more weight than what was revealed. The letter, she thought, might relate to the very tensions that had troubled her conscience the previous evening. Yet she spoke nothing aloud, understanding that her own restraint served both duty and observation. Pewbright continued his examination, noting the letter's unusual positioning among the ordinary correspondence. It had been placed at a deliberate angle, slightly askew from the vertical, as though signalling priority without explicit statement. In a community attuned to appearance, such subtle misalignment was often more revealing than overt declarations. He placed it carefully on top of the stack, a gesture calculated to preserve both the evidence and the discretion demanded by local custom. The morning unfolded with measured civility. Parishioners arrived to inquire about hymn books and bell maintenance, each greeting executed with precision. Pewbright noted the minor hesitations and overpolished bows, gestures that in a less observant eye might have seemed trivial, but in East Byford suggested private anxieties and unspoken judgment. One visitor, a matron of some standing, engaged in casual conversation about the upcoming fundraising tea, her words formal, yet shadowed by a slight stiffness in posture. She praised the committee for diligence, yet her eyes flickered briefly toward the envelope on the desk, betraying curiosity carefully concealed by propriety. Bernardine, standing quietly at the edge of the office, observed these interactions with an attentive calm. Her thoughts returned to the confessional, to the words that had lingered in her mind without resolution. In the context of the letter, she perceived a pattern of indirect communication, a latticework of concern and caution carefully embroidered into everyday exchanges. Pewbright, noting her contemplative gaze, refrained from comment, allowing her understanding to emerge organically, as was often the most effective method in navigating the village's subtle moral economy. A minor interruption occurred when a parishioner requested clarification about a donation recorded in last month's ledger. The vicar's assistant, summoned to provide detail, hesitated briefly before offering a carefully measured explanation, phrasing each word with the meticulous care of someone aware that error or omission might carry consequences far beyond the immediate transaction. Pewbright's attention caught the slight tremor in the assistant's hand as he retrieved the relevant pages, a gesture so fleeting it could easily have escaped notice. Bernardine observed the same subtle nervousness, recognizing it as the shadow of the community's unspoken expectations. The inspector's observations extended to the smallest details, the alignment of writing on the letterhead, the pressure of a pen's indentation, the fractional hesitation before a response to inquiry. Each indicated layers of intent, and collectively they suggested that East Byford's civility was a performance meticulously maintained, not merely for appearances, but as a mechanism of moral regulation. The missed or mislaid letter, seemingly trivial, now hinted at intervention, a deliberate effort to guide attention, suppress or direct concern, and maintain the social latticework without overt disruption. Pewbright allowed a moment's pause to catalogue these nuances. He noted which parishioners lingered longest by the desk, who allowed their eyes to dart toward the envelope, who diverted attention with polite conversation. Each subtle gesture, in his experience, could yield insight more potent than confession or complaint. Bernardine, observing alongside him, registered these subtleties with the quiet tension of someone balancing duty, conscience, and curiosity. As the morning progressed, the parish office emptied gradually, leaving a quieter space for reflection. Pewbright examined the ledger once more, noting the careful sequence of donations, minutes, and procedural notes. One entry, a minor discrepancy of date and signature, attracted his attention, a donation recorded on the 21st of the month, yet the receipt bore the 18th. The difference, slight and easily dismissed, could suggest clerical error, but in East Byford, error was rarely accidental. It was a gesture, a signal, a subtle indication of misalignment between public record and private reality. Bernardine's gaze returned to the misplaced envelope, her fingers brushing its edge with the faintest hesitation. The sheet of paper it contained had conveyed civility, but in its precise form, it hinted at unease, caution, and perhaps quiet admonition. She recognized that the confession she had received might intersect with this written communication, though neither document revealed the full truth. Pewbright, observing her careful attention, allowed the moment to linger. A silent acknowledgement of the convergence of moral observation and human frailty. Finally, a small, seemingly trivial gesture caught the inspector's attention. As he replaced the letter in the stack, a faint slip of paper fell from its folds, a folded corner, barely visible, bearing a short, nearly illegible note. Pewbright did not read it immediately. The significance lay not in its content, but in its existence, a second layer of communication concealed within a seemingly ordinary letter. Bernardine, sensing the subtle shift in tone, paused and raised her eyebrows ever so slightly. The morning, ordered and polite, had now yielded an anomaly, small yet precise, that suggested deliberate intention behind what had appeared casual or accidental. The chapter closed with this understated revelation. East Byford's routine, its carefully managed civility, had produced a minor disturbance, a signal for those attuned to such nuances. The confession of the previous night, the mislaid envelope, the faintly folded note. Together they suggested the presence of deliberate concealment, a subtle pattern of moral anxiety threading through the village. Pewbright and Bernardine shared a quiet understanding, recognizing that the next step in unraveling these intertwined social signals would require patience, attention, and the unhurried application of observation over speculation. A question hung, unspoken yet tangible. What precisely had prompted the need for such careful, concealed correspondence, and whose reputation might quietly tremble as a result? Choir practice took place in the church's small transept, where sunlight filtered through stained glass, painting the pews in muted reds and golds. The air was thick with the faint scent of polished wood and old hymn books, a combination that always seemed to induce both reverence and apprehension. Inspector Pewbright arrived in the mid-morning lull, notebook in hand, ostensibly to observe the acoustics of the space in relation to bell repairs, though in truth his attention was more attuned to human behavior than timbre resonance. Bernardine accompanied him quietly, keeping her distance from the singers while noting expressions, posture, and the subtle interchanges that conveyed unspoken information. The choir assembled with meticulous adherence to hierarchy, sopranos in front, altos slightly behind, tenors on the right, and basses near the organ. Each individual entered with the studied ease of those accustomed to communal expectation, yet Pewbright detected microtensions in the arrangements. One soprano, unusually early, lingered by the lectern longer than etiquette demanded, glancing toward the organist with a faint twitch of irritation at some perceived slight. The organist, in turn, displayed a careful patience, his fingers tapping lightly on the keys before commencing a practice prelude. Bernadine observed both with quiet apprehension. Her mind lingered on the recent confession, noting how its shadows seemed to touch even these routine gestures. A minor dispute arose almost immediately over the selection of hymns. The vicar's assistant suggested a new arrangement for the opening, which was met with polite resistance by the choir matron, who insisted on adherence to the customary order. The debate unfolded in subdued tones, each phrase measured for propriety rather than persuasion. Pewbright, seated at a pew near the back, noted the subtle cues, the matron's fingernails tapping once, twice, then pausing, the assistant's slight incline forward, almost imperceptible, the organist's quiet sigh audible only to the attentive ear. In East Byford, even disagreement was conducted with discretion, yet disagreement nonetheless revealed a latticework of hierarchy, preference, and concealed rivalry. Bernadine observed the participants with habitual attention to detail. She noted a new choir member, a young tenor, whose glances toward the soprano suggested unease, though he offered no words of dissent. It occurred to her that minor anxieties might well be compounded by the confession that still weighed upon her conscience. Pewbright, noting her thoughtful expression, allowed the observation to pass silently. He understood that the nun's careful discretion was itself a means of gathering insight. As rehearsal commenced, the organist played a subdued prelude, and voices joined in careful, harmonious unison. Pewbright's ears, trained to detect dissonance beyond the musical kind, noted slight hesitations and the occasional over-enunciation of vowels. These were minor, easily dismissed as inexperience or nervousness, yet he catalogued them meticulously. One alto, Mrs. Thackeray, consistently lagged a fraction behind the beat, her eyes flicking toward the conductor each time, a gesture that suggested both deference and concealed worry. Pewbright noted the pattern, her attentiveness was precise, but her compliance carried the faintest trace of reluctance. During a brief intermission, conversation turned to the upcoming parish fundraising tea. Mrs. Clavering, who had arrived to observe the choir in a supervisory capacity, offered praise for the group's dedication. Yet her words carried the subtle edge of admonishment. It is commendable that we uphold both harmony and punctuality. One hopes we shall not be distracted by trivialities. The choir members murmured polite assent, but Pewbright observed the slight tightening of shoulders, the quick, downward glance of eyes that sought the floor rather than meet hers directly. In East Byford, civility was a currency, and Mrs. Clavering was its vigilant treasurer. The vicar's assistant approached the organist with a question about hymn numbering, speaking in careful, indirect language. Might it be preferable to consider the third stanza as primary, or shall we adhere to the printed sequence? He asked. The organist replied with deliberate neutrality, allowing his hands to hover over the keys. Sequence is customary, yet one may accommodate preference if it does not disrupt decorum. Each word was chosen to preserve both authority and courtesy, yet the phrasing subtly suggested that control was neither relinquished nor fully asserted. Pewbright recorded the exchange, noting how even minor procedural matters could reveal hidden allegiances, anxieties, or resentments. Bernardine's gaze returned to the young tenor, who now adjusted his collar with a nervous precision, as though the mere act of correct appearance might shield him from judgment. Pewbright noticed this and filed it away alongside the tremor of the vicar's assistant and the habitual fidgeting of Mrs. Thackeray. In East Byford, even physical comportment could betray the slightest moral or social uncertainty. The inspector's dry humour, as always, suggested amusement at these minor but telling human foibles. The village's hierarchy, reinforced through custom and observation, seemed to hum beneath the surface of every polite exchange. A minor interruption occurred when a soprano accidentally dropped a hymn book. The incident passed without comment, yet Pewbright's attention focused on the response, a swift, silent retrieval by the choir matron, accompanied by a nearly imperceptible glance toward the young tenor, whose cheeks tinged with faint colour. Bernardine's eyes flicked to the same exchange. The minor disturbance, trivial in itself, highlighted a network of observation. Subtle rebuke, concealed embarrassment, and the constant maintenance of social equilibrium. In East Byford, even accidents were opportunities for the display and management of reputation. As rehearsal resumed, Pewbright noted small, persistent anomalies. A voice slightly off-key, a hesitant pause before an entry, the imperceptible shift of weight from foot to foot. Each sign, minor individually, accumulated into a broader tableau of apprehension, careful monitoring, and moral attentiveness. Bernardine, silently aware of the confession that lingered in her mind, perceived the same pattern, recognizing that private anxieties often intersected with public ritual. Pewbright's subtle, almost invisible notation of these behaviors suggested a growing awareness of threads that might later connect, revealing motives or concerns that were carefully concealed under a veneer of ordinary practice. The organist paused briefly, adjusting the stop with precise deliberation, and a hushed murmur passed through the choir. Pewbright observed the reaction. Eyes shifted, hands smoothed over hymnals, a faint exhale of controlled breath. One alto whispered a remark about what one should not overlook, prompting another to glance sideways, as though acknowledging a shared understanding without overt speech. Bernardine felt the prickle of recognition. In East Byford, caution and discretion governed both speech and gesture, and meaning was often conveyed in silence or half-uttered phrases. Toward the conclusion of practice, the organist asked whether the third stanza might be repeated for clarity. Mrs. Thackeray and the soprano exchanged brief, careful glances, coordinating with imperceptible nods before complying. Pewbright noted the subtle hierarchy of influence: who deferred, who guided, who observed quietly from the margins. Bernardine's attention focused on the young tenor once more. He now held his hymn book with an exactness suggesting both nervousness and conscious effort to avoid error. These minor details, cumulative in their significance, underscored the pervasive moral and social consciousness that shaped even routine musical performance in East Byford. As the rehearsal ended, villagers filed quietly toward the exit, maintaining measured pace and polite acknowledgement. Bernardine lingered briefly, straightening a hymn book on the lectern, her mind revisiting the confession and the small signs of unease observed throughout practice. Pewbright, standing slightly apart, recorded the micro-patterns he had catalogued: tremors, hesitations, glances, and gestures, each a discrete marker of underlying anxiety or moral concern. The choir, though outwardly harmonious, revealed beneath its surface a lattice of influence, suspicion, and reputational awareness that could not be discerned without attentive observation. The chapter closed with a small, almost imperceptible clue. As Bernardine collected stray hymnals, she noticed a piece of folded paper tucked between the pages of one. Its presence was subtle, unnoticed by the choir, yet deliberate, the corner peaking just enough to suggest intention. Pewbright observed her hesitation as she held it briefly, recognizing in the action a small but meaningful deviation from routine. In East Byford, revelation arrived not in spectacle but in gesture, in the careful placement of paper, in the slight tremor of a hand. A question lingered between them. What had prompted this silent signal, and whose apprehension or intention did it now reveal? The parish council convened in the modest council room of East Byford, where sunlight fell in careful angles across varnished tables and polished chairs, revealing faint scratches long memorized by frequent observation. A portrait of the late rector gazed down from the wall, eyes stern yet impartial, and the faint smell of wax polish mingled with the lingering aroma of morning tea. Inspector Pewbright arrived early, notebook in hand, allowing the minor ceremonial arrangements, chair placement, cup alignment, and agenda distribution to unfold without interference. Bernardine followed silently, mindful of the church's quiet etiquette and equally attuned to the tensions beneath the surface. Mrs. Clavering, chairwoman of both the council and the parish fundraising committee, called the meeting to order with a measured tap of her hand on the table. "We are assembled to discuss matters of duty and propriety," she said, voice formal and steady, though Pewbright noted a subtle sharpening of tone when her gaze swept the room. "Let us ensure that our deliberations uphold both tradition and decorum." The councillors acknowledged her with polite nods, some slightly delayed, as though each was calculating the precise degree of deference required. The meeting began with minor procedural matters, the scheduling of bell repairs, confirmation of subscription lists, and allocation of seating for the upcoming fundraising tea. Pewbright observed the participants closely. Mr. Davenhill, a long-serving councillor, spoke first on bell repairs, emphasizing historical precedent while carefully avoiding criticism of current committee arrangements. His phrasing suggested awareness of a delicate hierarchy, a balance between respect for tradition and subtle assertion of knowledge. The vicar's assistant interjected politely, deferring to Mr. Davenhill while quietly clarifying procedural details. Their exchange, almost inaudible to the casual listener, was a miniature dance of social power where civility masked private negotiation. Bernardine, seated near the window, noticed a faint tension in the room's air. The previous evening's confession lingered in her mind, though she revealed nothing. Yet the subtleties of gesture, pause, and glance resonated differently now. A frown, slightly too long, a hand hovering over the table before settling deliberately, a cough that came just after a minor disagreement. Pewbright, noting her concentration, allowed the observations to proceed without interruption. In East Byford, the minutiae of etiquette were often as revealing as words themselves. A minor dispute arose regarding the allocation of donations to the church organ fund. One councillor, Mrs. Fenwick, suggested a redistribution of recently pledged sums, emphasizing equitable consideration. Mrs. Clavering responded with careful neutrality, noting only that allocations should reflect prior commitments. Yet the micro-tension was evident. Mrs. Fenwick's fingers tapped once on the table, a minor sign of impatience. Another councillor, Mr. Huxley, tilted his head ever so slightly, betraying awareness of a potential conflict without voicing it. Pewbright catalogued these nuances, understanding that in East Byford, subtlety often bore the weight of revelation. Discussion turned to correspondence, with a brief mention of letters received since the last meeting. The vicar's assistant read aloud a note concerning the upcoming tea, emphasizing procedural propriety in the arrangement of tables and the distribution of refreshments. When he mentioned a minor irregularity in the subscription list, a faint tightening of lips passed among the councillors. Pewbright noted the micro-expressions, a blink too long, a shoulder tensing, eyes briefly lowering. Bernardine's attention was similarly drawn to a letter resting beside Mrs. Clavering's notebook, slightly askew from the edge of the table, a detail she remembered from earlier observation in the parish office. The positioning suggested deliberate prioritization, a silent cue to which only the most attentive responded. Mr. Davenhill attempted to steer the conversation back to Bell Repairs, framing his suggestion in indirect terms. Might it not be prudent to consider both historical timing and present circumstance when planning our schedule? His phrasing, formally courteous yet subtly insistent, implied a critique of current arrangements without direct confrontation. The vicar's assistant offered a non-committal nod, the organist a faint smile of acquiescence, and Mrs. Clavering allowed a slight pause before returning to the agenda. Each movement was precise, measured, and indicative of underlying negotiation, a contest of influence conducted without overt declaration. Bernardine's gaze shifted to the counsellor's hands. Several rested lightly on the table, fingers interlaced, while others hovered above pens or notebooks, a subconscious display of readiness and caution. Pewbright noted the patterns. The more an individual sought to preserve reputation, the more careful their physical comportment. He understood that moral anxiety in East Byford was expressed not in raised voices or overt complaint, but in the minutiae of posture, hesitation, and the polite management of expression. Bernardine reflected silently that the weight of the previous night's confession might intersect with these subtle tensions, though the precise connection remained invisible to all but the most observant. A discussion of committee protocol prompted further micro-signals. Mrs. Fenwick proposed a slight alteration in meeting procedure, suggesting an additional verification step for donations. The suggestion was framed as concern for propriety, yet Pewbright observed Mrs. Clavering's brief arching of one eyebrow, a tiny indicator of guarded awareness. Mr. Huxley's lips pressed lightly together while a younger counsellor, Miss Prendergast, inclined her head in attentive caution. Bernardine noted the nearly imperceptible flinches and adjustments in posture. The council members' equilibrium depended on subtle calibration of expectation, reputation, and social pressure. At a lull, Pewbright permitted himself a small interjection, phrased with formal understatement. It appears our village maintains vigilance not only over funds, but over propriety itself. One hopes that diligence extends equally to all quarters. His words, carefully measured, elicited polite assent from some, slight deflection from others, and, in at least one instance, a rapid glance toward the misplaced letter, a flicker of unease. Bernardine registered the movement, noting how even indirect commentary could provoke quiet acknowledgement, or discreet concealment, within the social latticework of East Byford. The meeting moved to minor administrative items, approval of minutes, scheduling of future gatherings, and clarification of the fundraising event's decorative arrangements. All were conducted in understated tones, yet every phrase seemed loaded with implicit expectation. Pewbright recorded the cadence of speech, the selection of words, the infinitesimal pauses that spoke volumes about hierarchy, apprehension, and the management of public versus private perception. Bernardine's own attention, sharpened by conscience and habit, caught the slight tremor of Mrs. Fenwick's hand as she reached for her notebook, and the careful realignment of Mr. Davenhill's spectacles, a gesture simultaneously habitual and defensive. Toward the end of the meeting, discussion returned to the mislaid correspondence briefly mentioned at the outset. Mrs. Clavering touched the edge of the envelope, now partially obscured beneath her notebook. "It appears a minor irregularity has arisen," she said, formal yet with a subtle inflection of tension. "We shall, of course, address it with appropriate discretion." Her phrasing implied both acknowledgement and avoidance, a recognition that the irregularity's significance lay less in content than in the reputational implications of its handling, Pewbright observed the reactions: a blink too long, a micro-shift in posture, and the almost imperceptible bite of lips. Bernadine's attention, as always, was attuned to the unspoken. She sensed that the envelope's presence now resonated beyond mere clerical curiosity. As the council adjourned, the villagers moved toward the door with careful attention to posture, bowing lightly to one another, adjusting gloves and exchanging formal pleasantries. Pewbright and Bernadine lingered, noting the subtle residual tension, a hand left hovering over a notebook, a foot tapping softly, eyes avoiding one another. The envelope, small and unobtrusive, had already begun to generate its quiet ripple through the social fabric. In East Byford, reputation was the currency by which civility was maintained, and any deviation, however minor, might cast shadows across multiple interactions. The chapter closed with a nearly invisible, yet meaningful, shift. As Bernadine straightened the papers on the council table, she noticed the corner of the mislaid envelope protruding slightly, a subtle gesture indicating intention or awareness. She paused, fingers brushing the edge, while Pewbright, observing her hesitation, registered the silent question it posed, whether the irregularity was accidental, deliberately concealed, or an indirect signal meant for the perceptive eye. In East Byford, revelation rarely arrived through overt declaration. It manifested through gesture, placement, and nuance. And in that moment, the envelope promised the first tangible thread leading toward clarity, if only one possessed the patience and discretion to follow it. The afternoon sun fell at a low angle over East Byford, painting the narrow streets in shades of muted gold. Inspector Pewbright strolled deliberately toward the vicarage, his notebook tucked neatly beneath one arm, while Bernadine walked a respectful step behind. The vicarage, modest yet dignified, exuded a quiet propriety, its windows reflecting both sunlight and the meticulous upkeep of lawn and garden. Pewbright observed, as ever, the micro-signals of village life. Curtains drawn just slightly askew, a gate latched with particular care, a bicycle resting against a wall as if placed with precise deliberation. These details, seemingly trivial, were the indicators of the social lattice, of reputations carefully managed, and the anxieties that accompanied them. Upon entering, they were greeted with the customary civility. The vicar rose, inclined his head in gentle welcome, and offered the standard greeting, his words tempered with the formal inflection appropriate to a man of office. "Inspector Pewbright, Sister Bernadine, you are most welcome. I trust your morning proceeded without complication." His phrasing suggested politeness rather than curiosity, yet Pewbright noted the slight narrowing of his eyes, an almost imperceptible signal of measured observation. "Thank you, Reverend," Pewbright replied evenly. "We have been attending to routine matters, though as you know, even routine has its subtleties." His remark, casual in delivery yet pointed in implication, was a reminder that social equilibrium was rarely as simple as it appeared. Bernadine took her seat quietly, noting the careful arrangement of chairs and the way small gestures maintained decorum without overt instruction. The vicar, settling behind his desk, began discussing parish affairs with his customary formality. He mentioned the fundraising tea, the bell maintenance, and routine correspondence, each item framed with the precise diction of someone who understood both the importance and the delicacy of perception. Yet his attention occasionally flicked toward a small stack of letters, the uppermost slightly askew, a detail Pewbright had already noted from the council meeting. The imperceptible alignment suggested deliberate placement, a signal subtle but intentional. Bernadine observed the vicar's hands, noting the slight tremor as he adjusted a pen and realigned the letters. Pewbright, ever attentive, catalogued the gesture alongside the minor hesitations and glances shared among parish officials during the morning council. In East Byford, such motions were often more revealing than any spoken disclosure, for they betrayed the tension between public expectation and private knowledge. The conversation drifted toward recent confessions in the parish, discussed with formal discretion and indirect language. "It is, of course, my duty to maintain the sanctity of the confessional," the vicar remarked, voice even. "Yet one must sometimes wonder at the weight of certain anxieties borne silently by parishioners." His phrasing, deliberate and balanced, suggested an acknowledgement without revelation. Pewbright allowed a faint smile to escape, noting the elegant circumspection. Bernardine, in contrast, felt a ripple of unease, recalling the previous night's confession and the letter observed earlier. A minor interruption occurred when the vicar's assistant delivered a note extending the formal greetings of Mrs. Clavering and the council and requesting guidance on the disposition of recent donations. The vicar accepted it with precise courtesy, acknowledging the envelope's presence while observing the sender's handwriting with careful attention. Pewbright noticed the assistant's brief glance toward the slightly misaligned letter on the desk, the fraction of hesitation that spoke of conscious calculation. Bernardine registered the same subtlety, understanding that the intersection of duty, discretion, and reputation was manifest even in the handling of ordinary correspondence. Discussion turned to the upcoming choir performance. The vicar remarked on the dedication of the singers, noting the apparent harmony while hinting at underlying tensions. "Even the most melodic voices," he observed, "may conceal minor dissonances. Harmony is not merely sound, it is conduct, observation, and adherence to expectation." Pewbright, silently amused by the understated precision of the remark, recorded it for reference. Bernardine considered its implications, connecting it to the tremors, hesitations, and micro-shifts observed both in rehearsal and at the council meeting. A knock at the vicarage door heralded a visitor, Mr. Huxley, one of the more exacting parish councillors, who entered with careful, deliberate movement. His gaze shifted first to the letters, then to the vicar, and finally rested momentarily on Bernardine, whose posture remained composed yet attentive. Huxley's hands, clasped lightly in front, betrayed only the faintest tremor, a minute signal of awareness and caution. He presented a brief report concerning subscription discrepancies, phrased with extreme courtesy, then allowed the vicar and Pewbright to respond. Pewbright observed the micro-negotiation in Huxley's phrasing, indirect deference paired with subtle assertion of knowledge. Bernardine noted the interplay of hands and eyes, the controlled pacing of sentences, the way Huxley's voice dipped at the end of each phrase, as though weighing implication as carefully as words. The inspector catalogued these nuances silently, recognizing that East Byford's conflicts rarely erupted. They were instead conducted beneath the surface, in gesture, phrasing, and social rhythm. While Huxley continued, the vicar's eyes flicked once more toward the slightly protruding corner of the mislaid envelope, now partially hidden beneath a desk blotter. His gaze was quick, almost imperceptible, yet Pewbright caught it, a faint signal of concern or at least deliberate acknowledgement. Bernardine's attention followed the movement, her fingers resting lightly upon her own notebook. The envelope, though minor, seemed increasingly central to the silent choreography of observation, intention, and concealed anxiety. The discussion moved to the topic of parish outreach. The vicar emphasized discretion and propriety in handling inquiries, framing his guidance with formal politeness that left both counsel and discretion intact. Pewbright noted the undercurrent of moral responsibility conveyed through subtle speech, a reminder that appearance, reputation, and adherence to duty were inseparable from action itself. Bernardine registered the faint tightening of the assistant's jaw, the gentle shift of Mr. Huxley's weight, and the imperceptible lift of a chair leg as all elements of the unspoken dialogue. A minor, almost accidental occurrence punctuated the conversation. The vicar's pen rolled slightly across the desk, coming to rest near the protruding edge of the envelope. Pewbright's eyes flicked, noting that both Bernardine and the vicar adjusted their positions in a near-simultaneous gesture, small, measured, and seemingly coincidental, yet precisely choreographed. The envelope's presence, its deliberate partial concealment, had created a subtle resonance in behavior, revealing awareness of something unspoken. Finally, the vicar offered a reflection on moral responsibility, phrased in the carefully indirect language characteristic of East Byford. It is often the quietest burdens that weigh most heavily upon conscience. One may observe propriety in every gesture, yet still harbour concern for what is unseen, unknown, or deliberately withheld. Pewbright noted the phrasing with appreciation, while Bernardine felt the familiar echo of her own unease. The confession, the mislaid correspondence, the careful observation of gesture, all converged in this quiet acknowledgement of subtle social and moral tension. The meeting of observation concluded as the vicar prepared tea. Bernardine assisted, placing cups with careful alignment, while Pewbright catalogued minor movements, the lift of a hand, the adjustment of a sleeve, the slight hesitation before passing a cup. Each gesture, individually trivial, collectively reinforced the lattice of reputation, social expectation, and moral vigilance that governed East Byford. The mislaid envelope, the tremor of hands, the flicker of glance, all were part of a continuing dialogue conducted without words. As the afternoon drew to a close, Bernardine noticed a small crease along the protruding corner of the envelope, a detail previously overlooked. Her fingers hovered briefly, pausing in recognition of its subtle significance. Someone had handled it with deliberate care, perhaps in preparation for observation or for concealment. Pewbright, standing quietly, noted her hesitation and the almost imperceptible shift in her expression. In East Byford, the smallest signal could carry more weight than explicit confession. The chapter ended with this subtle resonance. The mislaid envelope, once incidental, had become a focal point of attention, prompting gestures, glances, and hesitation from multiple participants. Bernardine and Pewbright exchanged only the faintest acknowledgement of the moment, a recognition that something intentional, significant, and yet quietly hidden was at play. The afternoon's conversation, civil and precise, had revealed more in micro-gesture than in words, leaving a silent question suspended in the warm air of the vicarage. Whose discretion was being tested, and to what end? The evening light filtered through the narrow windows out of the parish office, turning dust motes into a faint, golden haze. Inspector Pewbright arrived with measured steps, his notebook secured beneath his arm, and Bernardine trailing slightly behind, as ever attentive to the minutiae of gesture and posture. The office, recently cleared of daytime visitors, retained the faint aroma of ink and polished wood, mingled with the lingering scent of strong tea. The room, so ordinary in appearance, felt heavy with unspoken observation. Even in absence, the parish's meticulous care seemed to exert an invisible scrutiny. Miss Whitcomb greeted them with her habitual reserve, offering the faintest inclination of the head before returning to the stack of correspondence on her desk. Her posture was precise, yet Pewbright detected the subtle tension in her shoulders, a faint shadow of unease accompanying her careful civility. "Inspector," she said, voice low, "there is a matter of correspondence that may require your attention." Her words, measured and polite, suggested both caution and an acknowledgement of potential significance. Pewbright's gaze immediately rested on the envelope, still resting at a slight angle beneath the heavier stack of letters. Its corner protruded just enough to betray its presence without drawing overt notice. Bernardine, attentive as ever, noted the subtle crease along its edge, suggesting prior handling. "Miss Whitcomb," Pewbright began, his tone casual, yet pointed. "Would you happen to know whether this correspondence has been read or merely filed?" His phrasing invited disclosure without pressure. The secretary adjusted her glasses with delicate precision, fingers briefly brushing the desk. "It was noted, sir, yet I confess uncertainty as to its original routing. It may have been set aside deliberately, though I cannot assert this with certainty." Her choice of words carried the faintest implication that oversight and intention were inseparable in East Byford, a distinction Pewbright had long observed. Pewbright took the envelope with meticulous care, noting the subtle differences in paper texture and the gentle indentation at its upper corner. He handled it as if the paper itself might yield a secret through gesture or placement. "One notices," he remarked dryly, "that even minor correspondence can exert influence upon the patterns of civility." Bernadine allowed a faint smile to surface, recognizing the understated humor, though her attention remained on the envelope's quiet significance. They examined its contents, a single sheet, typed in impeccable formal language, yet with phrasing slightly more insistent than ordinary. The message concerned parish procedure, subscriptions, and the timing of committee duties. One line, however, struck both observer and assistant with subtle force. "It is prudent that attention be given to irregularities, however minor they may appear." The sentence was polite, yet carried an unmistakable undertone of admonishment, implying vigilance and the threat of reputational consequence. Bernadine's fingers hovered over the text as Pewbright traced a line of observation from the phrasing to the envelope's deliberate placement. The creased corner suggested prior handling, perhaps even intended signaling. Pewbright allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of potential implications settle. In East Byford, subtlety often bore more authority than direct statement. A gesture, a misalignment, a minor crease could indicate intention more clearly than a proclamation. A knock at the office door introduced a minor disturbance. Mrs. Clavering, appearing slightly breathless from the late day's errands, entered with customary politeness. Her eyes immediately assessed the envelope and the two observers. "I hope my intrusion is not untimely," she said, voice measured, "but I thought to ensure that all matters of correspondence have been attended with due propriety." The phrasing, formally courteous, betrayed the faintest tremor of concern. Her careful eye lingered on the protruding envelope, registering its unsanctioned attention. Pewbright inclined his head slightly, responding with careful neutrality. "Your timing is impeccable, Mrs. Clavering. One could scarcely hope for more attentive oversight." Bernadine observed the slight lift of the chair, the micro-adjustment of her gloves as she settled, and noted the tension in her shoulders, a signal, however discreet, of apprehension beneath civility. The envelope had already begun to influence posture, gesture, and expression, revealing its quiet potency within the parish's social lattice. Mrs. Clavering's attention shifted to the contents of the envelope as Pewbright allowed a brief pause. "We are considering minor irregularities in procedure," he said lightly, "though the extent of concern remains under observation." The words, polite yet pointed, highlighted the inspector's awareness of subtle authority. The chairwoman's lips pressed lightly together, and a near imperceptible exhale betrayed a slight release of tension. She acknowledged the envelope's significance without verbal confirmation. A quiet debate arose over procedure for handling correspondence. Miss Whitcomb proposed formal filing with notation, while Mrs. Clavering suggested an additional review step, emphasizing propriety and accountability. Pewbright observed the carefully calibrated responses, nods fractionally too slow, eyes flicking toward the envelope, and subtle alignment of notebooks to preserve discretion. Bernadine recorded the gestures silently. The room, so seemingly ordinary, resonated with the unspoken dialogue of moral vigilance, authority, and reputational concern. Pewbright's attention turned to the envelope itself. The creased corner and careful positioning suggested more than mere clerical oversight. Someone had intentionally left it in a state to be noticed without drawing overt attention. Bernardine's gaze followed the folds, registering the faint impression of handwriting beneath the typed text, a secondary signal perhaps, or an indication of a prior handler's subtle intention. In East Byford, communication rarely arrived through direct statement. Gestures, placement, and deliberate handling spoke volumes. The vicar's assistant arrived mid-discussion, bearing a minor ledger of subscriptions, his movement precise and deliberate. His eyes, however, lingered briefly on the envelope and then flicked toward Bernardine, a silent acknowledgement that something was amiss. Pewbright noted the shift in expression, a fraction of surprise, quickly masked by habitual civility. Bernardine caught the nuance, understanding that even minor acknowledgement could influence the trajectory of observation in the village. Mrs. Clavering, sensing the moment, addressed the room with impeccable formality. "It appears we must exercise additional vigilance," she said, voice measured yet edged with emphasis, in both the reception and distribution of correspondence to ensure that no inadvertent deviation from propriety arises. Her phrasing, perfectly neutral in tone, yet carrying the slightest pressure of admonishment, elicited subtle nods and quiet acknowledgement from the assembled staff. Pewbright, with dry amusement, catalogued each micro-response. The tilt of a head, the adjustment of gloves, the ever-so-slight delay in returning gaze. A small, nearly imperceptible movement marked the close of this chapter's observation. Bernardine, fingers lightly resting on the envelope, noticed a faint smudge along its edge, too deliberate for accident, too small for casual oversight. She paused, considering the implications. An intentional marker, a signal, a clue whose meaning was yet undefined. Pewbright, standing just behind, observed her hesitation and the gentle shift of expression that accompanied it. The social equilibrium of East Byford, meticulously maintained through civility and hierarchy, now hinted at undercurrents unseen but increasingly palpable. The chapter closed on the quiet question the envelope provoked. Its deliberate positioning, minor crease, and subtle marking had already influenced posture, gaze, and conversation. In East Byford, the most significant disclosures arrived not through overt declaration, but through gesture, placement, and the careful orchestration of attention. Pewbright and Bernardine, attuned to the village's rhythms, recognized that the envelope represented more than minor correspondence. It was a whisper of intention, a signpost toward revelation, and a reminder that even the smallest detail could cast shadows across reputation and conscience. Late morning brought a muted bustle to East Byford, the sun spilling unevenly across cobblestones and shop fronts, illuminating the careful neatness of a village perpetually concerned with appearances. Inspector Pewbright and Bernardine ambled along the main street, exchanging polite nods with passers-by, each greeting layered with a subtle assessment of posture, gesture, and eye contact. The shopkeepers, their hands folded precisely on counters, offered civility with the faintest undercurrent of curiosity. Pewbright's attention, as ever, was not drawn to the outward expressions alone, but to the invisible choreography of social expectation, deference, and concealed anxiety. Their first stop was the village post office, where letters and parcels accumulated beneath a glass-fronted shelf, each item indexed with clerical care. Pewbright inquired after correspondence received overnight, phrasing the question in gentle, formal tones. "Miss Wainwright, one wonders if any items might require particular attention, perhaps beyond the ordinary delivery." The postmistress, a woman whose posture suggested lifelong negotiation with propriety, adjusted her spectacles and inclined her head slightly. "There is a letter, sir," she said, voice measured, that arrived with no postmark. It was left carefully aside as if to preserve discretion. Pewbright's eyes, already attuned to nuance, detected the subtle significance in her phrasing. The envelope's treatment implied deliberate caution rather than oversight. Bernardine, silently observing, felt the familiar ripple of unease. The mislaid correspondence had now travelled beyond parish offices and council rooms, touching the public sphere without direct statement. Pewbright took note of the precise manner in which Miss Wainwright's fingers lingered near the envelope before withdrawing. A minor hesitation loaded with implication. The inspector examined the envelope without opening it, noting the slight indentation at the corner, the faint smudge, and the delicate folding, all signs of careful prior handling. "It seems," he remarked dryly, "that in East Byford even an envelope may influence the equilibrium of civility." Bernardine allowed herself a brief, almost imperceptible smile. Observation, she knew, was often more revealing than disclosure. From the post office, the pair proceeded to the village tea shop, where local gossip usually circulated under the guise of polite conversation. They seated themselves near the window, ordering tea with formality and attention to gesture. The proprietor, Mrs. Halliday, greeted them with practised cheer, yet her eyes darted subtly toward the street, as if confirming the absence or presence of those who might overhear. Pewbright's notebook remained closed, his gaze alert, cataloguing small movements, the rearrangement of teaspoons, the precise placement of sugar cubes, the way Mrs. Halliday adjusted her apron in response to perceived scrutiny. Conversation among the villagers was equally meticulous. Two matrons spoke in subdued tones about committee obligations, phrasing concern for punctuality and propriety with a careful balance of praise and admonishment. "One trusts all members will maintain the standards expected of them," one said, voice deliberate yet faintly edged with tension. The other replied, equally measured, "Indeed, though minor deviations may occur despite the best intentions." Pewbright's dry smile betrayed his amusement at the understated negotiation of moral oversight. Bernardine's attention lingered on the faint tremor of one woman's hand as she stirred her tea. Subtle enough to be dismissed, yet unmistakable to an observer trained to read the invisible currents of concern and reputation. A slight interruption arrived in the form of a young boy delivering newspapers. He hesitated near their table, glancing toward the street, then toward the pair, before handing a small bundle to a waiting customer. The boy's movements, minor and fleeting, nevertheless conveyed the same pattern observed throughout the village. An acute awareness of observation, an instinctive modulation of behavior in accordance with perceived expectations. Pewbright recorded the gesture silently. Bernardine noted the boy's subtle glance and the careful placement of the papers, connecting it to the broader network of vigilance that now encompassed the envelope. Their conversation turned at last to minor parish matters, phrased in indirect reference to the council meeting and choir rehearsal. Pewbright queried, with deliberate understatement, about minor irregularities in correspondence and procedural oversight. "One suspects," he said lightly, "that even the smallest deviation, if unnoticed, might ripple through our established patterns of propriety." Bernardine noted the careful balance in his phrasing, polite curiosity, low-key observation, and gentle provocation, all crafted to encourage disclosure without overt pressure. Across the table, Mrs. Halliday offered a subtle indication of awareness. She cleared her throat softly and remarked, "There are, of course, certain items which villagers prefer remain unnoticed, though their presence is rarely entirely unperceived." The phrasing, casual in delivery, carried the faintest suggestion of insider knowledge. Pewbright inclined his head slightly, absorbing both the content and the delivery, while Bernadine registered the minuscule rise of her eyebrows, signalling cautious acknowledgement. In East Byford, meaning was rarely direct. It resided in phrasing, gesture, and the pause between words. A minor but telling development occurred as Pewbright unfolded a small ledger found among the envelope's neighbours in the post office. The entries, neatly recorded, revealed a slight discrepancy in recent subscription dates, minor yet inconsistent with expected procedure. Bernadine noted the precise alignment of the figures, the even pressure of pen on paper, and the faint smudge near a single signature, a subtle anomaly suggesting careful concealment or deliberate signal. Pewbright allowed the observation to linger without immediate comment. Significance in East Byford often emerged gradually, revealed in sequences rather than sudden disclosure. As they prepared to leave, Bernadine noticed the envelope had been shifted slightly in its resting place by the postmistress, though not enough to suggest overt tampering. Her fingers hovered, brushing against its edge before withdrawing, an instinctive acknowledgement of the subtle cue. Pewbright observed her hesitation, noting the slight tilt of her head, the careful adjustment of her coat sleeve, gestures which in other circumstances might have been deemed inconsequential, yet here carried the weight of attentive awareness. The envelope, minor and unassuming, had begun to dictate the rhythm of observation, influencing both posture and expression. Walking toward the vicarage once more, the pair reflected silently on the patterns emerging. Pewbright noted the interconnected gestures, micro-hesitations, and controlled glances witnessed throughout the village that day. The choir matron's careful retrieval of a dropped hymn book, Mrs. Clavering's measured acknowledgement of irregularities, and now the subtle handling of the envelope at the post office and tea shop. Each incident, individually trivial, formed a lattice of intention and awareness, revealing that propriety and moral concern in East Byford were maintained as much through gesture and omission as through explicit statement. The chapter closed with a quiet, nearly imperceptible revelation. Bernadine, walking slightly ahead, paused at the corner of the street, her gaze falling on a small figure retreating into the shadows of a narrow alley. In the boy's hand was a folded note, the faint corner of which bore the unmistakable crease of careful handling. She did not speak, yet Pewbright observed the subtle tightening of her jaw, the micro-shift of her stance, and the deliberate slowing of her pace. The envelope, its contents still largely mysterious, had now begun to echo beyond official channels, entering the realm of private transmission. In East Byford, revelation was rarely dramatic. It arrived in gesture, placement, and silent acknowledgement. And in that moment, a question emerged without words. Who had chosen to move the note, and what unspoken message did it now carry through the lattice of observation, propriety, and moral vigilance? The late afternoon sun had begun to recede behind East Byford's gently undulating hills, casting long, muted shadows across the village lanes. Inspector Pewbright walked with measured pace toward the vicarage, Bernadine keeping a respectful distance, yet keenly attuned to the subtle signals of village life. A gate swung slightly askew, a cat perched on a low wall with silent, deliberate observation, and the careful alignment of flower pots along a window ledge. Each small adjustment of circumstance seemed imbued with intention, a reflection of the parish's continuous vigilance over propriety and perception. The vicarage, quiet and orderly, radiated its customary air of controlled civility. Pewbright noted the habitual gleam of the polished floor and the precise alignment of the vicar's desk, a tacit declaration that order, even in minutiae, reflected moral oversight. Bernadine followed, her own attention drawn to the placement of a small envelope atop the blotter, the same one that had travelled through council, choir, and post office. its corner protruded ever so slightly, inviting observation without declaration, a whisper of intention, discreet yet deliberate. The vicar greeted them with his usual formality, voice calm yet edged with a subtle attentiveness. "Inspector, Sister Bernardine, your presence is most welcome. I trust your inquiries proceed with both diligence and discretion." The phrasing was polite, indirect, yet suggested awareness of the underlying currents that had begun to shape the day's observations. Pewbright inclined his head slightly. "Indeed, Reverend. Discretion, as always, may reveal more than overt disclosure." Bernardine took a seat with quiet precision, her hands resting lightly on her lap, eyes flicking briefly toward the envelope. Miss Whitcomb, attending the desk with habitual reserve, indicated the envelope without comment, leaving its significance to the perceptive eye. Pewbright retrieved it with measured care, observing the delicate crease along its corner, the subtle impression of prior handling. He opened it slowly, allowing the text to reveal itself in careful increments. The letter, composed in formal, precise language, referenced minor irregularities in subscription logs and committee reports, yet the phrasing carried an unmistakable undertone of admonition. It would be prudent to ensure that all matters, however seemingly trivial, receive appropriate attention to avoid unintended consequences. Bernardine's fingers lingered near the text, tracing the lines without contact. Pewbright noted her hesitation, the micro-expression that suggested awareness of both potential culpability and communal consequence. The envelope, minor in appearance yet deliberate in placement and phrasing, exerted a quiet influence over posture, attention, and discourse. In East Byford, the weight of reputation often surpassed the significance of events themselves. A knock at the vicarage door introduced the first confrontation of the afternoon. Mrs. Clavering, appearing composed yet subtly tense, entered with deliberate politeness. Her eyes immediately sought the envelope, and a micro-flinch betrayed her recognition of its handling. "I trust I am not intruding?" she asked formally. "I wish to ensure that matters of correspondence have been addressed with due propriety." Her voice, calm and even, carried the faintest inflection of concern, a note only perceptible to those trained to read the nuances of intention. Pewbright responded with carefully measured neutrality. "Your attention, as always, is both timely and appreciated, Mrs. Clavering. We were merely reviewing the items with the discretion that you so keenly value." Bernardine observed the slight narrowing of the chairwoman's eyes, the controlled tightening of lips, the subtle inclination of her head as if weighing the implications of the envelope's presence. Even civility in East Byford could carry the weight of scrutiny. Mrs. Clavering's gaze, deliberate and precise, shifted to the vicar. "There are concerns," she said mildly, "that minor procedural anomalies may have escaped notice. One would hope that diligence and propriety are observed at every stage." The phrasing suggested caution rather than accusation, yet Pewbright noted the faint tremor of emphasis, enough to register unease without breaking decorum. Bernardine's attention focused on the subtle shift of her fingers atop her gloves, a gesture that reinforced the unspoken warning embedded in civility. The vicar offered his usual measured response. "Certainly, Mrs. Clavering. We shall ensure that all such matters receive attention commensurate with their potential impact." His words were neutral, yet the inflection hinted at both acknowledgement and containment. Pewbright, recording each micro-signal with quiet satisfaction, noted the faint alignment of notebooks and hands among the attendants. Posture and gesture reflected the invisible hierarchy of oversight, the interplay of obligation and discretion, the subtle orchestration of authority and reputation. Bernardine's gaze lingered on the envelope itself. Its faint smudge and precise crease suggested prior handling, likely by someone aware of the social lattice through which it travelled. Pewbright allowed her momentary observation, noting the careful pause of her fingers above the paper. A detail so minor it might be overlooked by the casual observer had already produced shifts in posture, gaze and gesture across multiple participants, a silent dialogue of influence, awareness and apprehension. Mrs. Clavering's attention returned to the inspector, phrasing her inquiry with a characteristic blend of civility and scrutiny. Inspector, one would hope that in reviewing correspondence, one remains vigilant to any indication of intent beyond the mere written word. After all, subtle guidance may carry more weight than overt instruction. Pewbright inclined his head slightly, a faint smile of dry amusement touching his lips. Indeed, Mrs. Clavering. Intent, much like propriety, often resides in the spaces between action and observation. Bernardine noted the precision of his words, the careful acknowledgement without confrontation, and the understated humor that softened the formal exchange. A slight interruption occurred as Miss Whitcomb produced a secondary note, folded and placed beneath the envelope, marked with a faint crease at the corner. "This arrived shortly after the first," she said, voice low, measured and respectful. The wording, though neutral, conveyed both awareness and caution. Bernardine's gaze sharpened. The envelope's journey, now augmented by a second piece of correspondence, hinted at deliberate orchestration rather than accidental placement. Pewbright catalogued the gesture, the crease, the fold, the alignment on the desk, all indicative of intent and observation. Discussion turned with understated politeness to the minor procedural discrepancies referenced in the letters. Each participant spoke with formal restraint, yet micro-expressions betrayed awareness, concern, or subtle defensiveness. Mrs. Clavering's hands rested lightly atop her notebook, adjusting occasionally as if to regulate expression. The vicar's eyes flicked toward the envelope and the secondary note, maintaining composure while registering concern. Bernardine traced the movement of eyes, hands, and posture, understanding that each minute gesture reinforced or responded to the silent social negotiation. As the afternoon waned, a quiet, nearly imperceptible shift emerged. Bernardine reached to adjust the envelope slightly, ensuring it lay flat without revealing its contents further. Her action was deliberate, precise, and yet understated, enough to signal attention, yet not authority. Pewbright observed the micro-tilt of her head, the almost invisible tightening of her shoulders, and the subtle weight of consideration that accompanied the gesture. The envelope, minor in appearance, had begun to dictate the flow of attention and posture, influencing the behavior of multiple individuals without explicit statement. The chapter closed on a nearly silent question. The envelope, with its crease, smudge, and deliberate placement, had travelled from choir rehearsal to council meetings, post office, and now the vicarage, shaping gestures, glances, and posture at every stage. The addition of the secondary note suggested coordination, intention, or subtle signalling within East Byford's lattice of propriety and reputation. Pewbright and Bernardine exchanged only the faintest acknowledgement of the unfolding pattern. The quiet awareness that the correspondence was no mere clerical oversight, but a carefully positioned instrument of influence. The final signal, a slight tremor in Mrs. Clavering's hand as she lifted her teacup, left an unspoken question hovering in the room. Who had orchestrated this subtle chain, and to what end would the carefully guided intentions now lead? The morning air in East Byford was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and polished stone, a reminder that even routine tidiness concealed the village's delicate social choreography. Inspector Pewbright walked slowly toward the parish hall, Bernardine a careful step behind, notebook in hand but unused for the moment. Observation, as always, mattered more than record. The village itself seemed aware of their purpose, the shutters slightly angled, the low hum of conversation tempered by polite restraint, each gesture calibrated to preserve civility while hinting at the weight of communal knowledge. Inside the hall, the chairs had been arranged with precise care for the meeting that would convene the parish committee. Sunlight fell in deliberate stripes across polished floorboards, highlighting faint scuffs and the occasional misalignment of furniture. Pewbright noted these minor imperfections with interest. Small deviations often indicated subtle shifts in attention or intent. Bernardine, similarly attuned, observed the careful placement of documents, the gentle creasing of envelopes, and the disciplined alignment of ledger pages, a choreography of propriety that masked the underlying tension of observation. Mrs. Clavering entered first, immaculate in dress and posture, followed by a near-simultaneous arrival of the vicar and Miss Whitcomb. Their greetings were understated, formal, and precise, conveying civility while masking the minute anxieties that lingered beneath. Pewbright watched the fleeting gestures, the tilt of a head, the micro-shift of a hand, the brief hesitation before speech, all subtle indicators of reputational vigilance. Bernardine's eyes followed the envelope, still present, now accompanied by the secondary note, its crease and placement suggesting deliberate orchestration rather than oversight. The committee convened with customary politeness, opening with minor procedural updates, confirmation of donations, scheduling of bell maintenance, and clarification of choir rehearsal arrangements. Each participant spoke in formal, measured tones, their diction polished, yet each phrase carried nuanced inflections betraying awareness of unspoken pressures. Pewbright observed the brief nods exchanged, the tiny adjustments of gloves or pens, the subtle realignments of posture, gestures that in a less attentive eye would appear trivial, but here communicated observation, hierarchy, and discretion. Discussion inevitably returned to correspondence. Miss Whitcomb, with her habitual discretion, produced the envelope and the secondary note, laying them before the vicar and Mrs. Clavering. "We have kept these under observation," she said softly, voice low but precise, "until a suitable time for review could be arranged." The phrasing suggested neutrality, yet the placement and timing of the disclosure carried significant weight. Pewbright noted the careful way Mrs. Clavering's fingers hovered before brushing the edges of the paper, a gesture suggesting both recognition and cautious appraisal. Pewbright opened the envelope first, reading aloud in calm, formal cadence. The content referenced minor irregularities in the subscription ledger and committee conduct, phrased in gentle but unmistakable admonition. Though all actions appear proper, one must ensure diligence is consistently applied. Oversight, however minor, may alter perception of integrity. The words, courteous yet pointed, elicited the faintest tremor in Mrs. Clavering's posture. Bernardine observed the subtle realignment of her hands, the fraction of a second delay before response, a visible hesitation betraying the envelope's influence on her otherwise composed demeanor. A soft exchange followed, formally polite, in which Mrs. Clavering acknowledged the observations without overt judgment, while the vicar reassured her that proper attention would be given to the concerns raised. Pewbright's voice remained low, precise, and devoid of dramatic emphasis. "It appears," he said, "that even in minor matters the preservation of reputation requires careful, continuous vigilance." Bernardine noted the understated humor in the phrasing, though the room's attention remained fixed upon the implications of the envelope's message. The secondary note, previously unnoticed by all but Bernardine, proved to contain a subtle signature. An initial in the corner, faintly inscribed, suggesting that the originator sought recognition without declaration. Pewbright allowed a brief moment of silence, observing the micro-shifts in gaze, posture, and hand placement. Mrs. Clavering's eyes flicked toward the signature, then toward the vicar, a silent assessment passing between them. Bernardine's fingers hovered briefly above the page, acknowledging its subtle significance without overt comment. The vicar spoke next, his voice calm, yet edged with the faintest attention to nuance. It is evident that care has been taken to communicate concerns without direct accusation. Such circumspection, while polite, invites interpretation by those observant enough to notice. Pewbright inclined his head, appreciating both the understatement and the subtle acknowledgement of layered social signalling. Bernardine's eyes tracked the brief nods among the committee members, each micro-gesture an unspoken acknowledgement of the delicate balance between observation, duty, and social propriety. As discussion turned to minor procedural follow-ups, Pewbright noted a particularly telling micro-moment. Miss Whitcomb, adjusting the placement of the secondary note, allowed a faint crease to catch the light, making the signature visible from a narrow angle. Her hand froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Bernardine to register the deliberate gesture. Pewbright, silent and observing, recognized that intention had been encoded not in words, but in placement and subtle exposure, a form of communication entirely in keeping with East Byford's nuanced social choreography. A soft, almost imperceptible signal passed between Mrs. Clavering and the vicar. A minute tilt of the head, a gentle exhale, a fleeting realignment of fingers. Each, seemingly ordinary, indicated mutual recognition of responsibility and discretion, acknowledgement of the message's significance, and tacit agreement on measured response. Bernardine recorded the gestures silently, understanding that the envelope's content had exerted influence far beyond its literal text. In East Byford, revelation was less about statement and more about micro-signals, controlled behavior, and the quiet orchestration of perception. Pewbright concluded the review with understated elegance. "It appears," he said quietly, "that the village maintains its equilibrium through observation, discretion, and careful attention to detail. Even the smallest deviation, if unnoticed, may ripple through our network of propriety." His tone was calm, dry, and lightly humorous, eliciting faint acknowledgement from the committee without breaking decorum. Bernardine noted the slight tilt of heads, the gentle exhalation of tension, the subtle restoration of composure, a collective sigh disguised as civility. The chapter and the immediate resolution of the envelope's mystery ended with a nearly imperceptible gesture. Bernardine, hands lightly adjusting the papers, noticed that the secondary note had been rotated slightly, the signature now visible only from a certain angle. The faint crease caught the light, revealing intent without explicit declaration. Pewbright, standing with quiet observation, registered the micro-signal, the orchestrator's subtle fingerprint upon the village's social fabric. The envelope, minor in appearance but deliberate in handling, had navigated council meetings, choir rehearsals, post office observation, tea shop murmurs, and private consultation, influencing gestures, posture, and conversation at every stage. The final crease and alignment acted as a quiet signature, signaling both responsibility and control. In East Byford, the most meaningful revelations were never dramatic. They emerged in gesture, placement, and nuanced observation. The silent question lingered: who had chosen this precise choreography, and what further subtleties might yet unfold in a village where propriety, reputation, and moral vigilance were so delicately entwined? Pewbright and Bernardine exchanged only the faintest acknowledgement of the resolution. No words were necessary. The subtle shifts in expression, posture, and micro-gesture conveyed the conclusion as effectively as any overt statement. The envelope had spoken in the language of East Byford, polite, indirect, carefully measured, and the observers had listened. The village itself, restored to its ordinary calm, seemed unaware of the silent drama that had unfolded in its midst, yet the echoes of subtle influence would persist, informing gesture, posture, and conversation for days to come. In the end, the mystery was less about revelation than recognition. The careful handling of correspondence, the placement of minor notes, and the orchestrated signals of intent had illuminated the delicate machinery of reputation, observation, and moral accountability. Pewbright, notebook finally closed, allowed himself a faint smile. Bernardine, attentive as always, recognized the quiet satisfaction of understanding rather than accusation. East Byford remained orderly, polite, and superficially serene, yet beneath its surface, subtle forces of influence had quietly realigned the lattice of propriety. And in that muted, disciplined calm, the final soft question lingered, not of crime, nor of error, but of attention. Whose intention had guided the envelope's journey, and what further consequences might arise from the faint, carefully measured gestures that so quietly shaped the village's world? The answer, as always in East Byford, would reveal itself not in words, but in posture, gaze, and the imperceptible orchestration of civility.